In the frozen forest of Belgium, December 1944, a single American officer made a decision that German commanders would later admit shattered their entire offensive strategy. His name has been largely forgotten by history, yet his actions at the crossroads town of St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge fundamentally altered the course of Hitler's last great gamble in the West. This is the story of Colonel Bruce Clarke and the 7th Armored Division's desperate stand that bought the Allied forces the time they needed to turn the tide. A story of impossible odds, tactical genius, and a defense so stubborn that even the enemy came to respect it. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. For weeks, Allied intelligence had dismissed the possibility of a major German counteroffensive. The Wehrmacht was supposedly broken, retreating on all fronts. Victory in Europe seemed inevitable, perhaps even before Christmas. But Adolf Hitler had other plans. At 0530 hours that morning, over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, better known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. 3 entire German armies crashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. Standing directly in the path of the German 6th Panzer Army was the small Belgian town of St. Vith, a critical road junction where 7 roads converged like spokes on a wheel. Whoever controlled St. Vith controlled movement throughout the northern Ardennes. For the Germans, it was essential. For the Americans, it was suddenly everything. The town was initially defended by the green troops of the 106th Infantry Division, men who had been in combat for less than 5 days. As the German assault intensified, 2 entire regiments of the 106th, some 8,000 men, were surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge east of St. Vith. It would become the largest American surrender since Bataan. Into this chaos rode Colonel Bruce Clarke and Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division. Clarke was 40 years old, a West Point graduate who had proven himself in North Africa and Normandy. Compact and intense, he was known for his engineering expertise and his ability to remain calm under impossible pressure. On the evening of December 16th, he received orders that would test both qualities to their absolute limit. Move immediately to St. Vith, assume command of all troops in the area, hold the town. Simple orders, impossible mission. The 7th Armored Division had been resting near the Dutch border after weeks of brutal fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. Now, Clarke's Combat Command B, approximately 5,000 men with 54 Sherman tanks and 36 armored infantry vehicles, began the desperate race southward through roads choked with retreating American units and panicked refugees. What should have been a 6-hour movement took nearly 18 hours. The roads were sheets of ice. Visibility was near zero in the freezing fog. And everywhere, Clarke saw the signs of catastrophe. Abandoned vehicles, discarded equipment, wild-eyed soldiers speaking of Tiger tanks, and SS troops appearing out of nowhere. Clarke reached St. Vith at 10:30 hours on December 17th. What he found was chaos in its purest form. The command structure of the 106th Division had effectively collapsed. Staff officers were burning documents, preparing for evacuation. Wounded men filled every available building. The town's few military policemen had abandoned their posts. And most critically, no one, absolutely no one, knew where the Germans were or in what strength they were coming. Clarke immediately established his command post in the St. Joseph's Cloister, a red brick monastery on the western edge of town. He gathered what officers he could find and began asking questions. The answers painted a grim picture. To the east, the two surrounded regiments of the 106th were finished. They just didn't know it yet. To the north, the German 6th Panzer Army was driving westward with at least 3 SS Panzer divisions. To the south, the 5th Panzer Army was pushing forward with equal force. St. Vith sat directly between these hammer blows, a nut waiting to be cracked. By December 18th, the situation had deteriorated further. The morning fog lifted briefly, revealing an apocalyptic landscape. The forests surrounding St. Vith were alive with German forces. Reconnaissance patrols reported enemy tanks less than 2 miles away in multiple directions. Artillery fire began falling on the town itself, methodical and deadly. Clarke made a decision that would define everything that followed. Against the urging of some officers to withdraw while withdrawal was still possible, he chose to defend. But not the town itself. That would be suicide. Instead, Clarke established a horseshoe-shaped defensive perimeter on the high ground east of St. Vith, using the natural terrain features and the road network to maximum advantage. It was a defense designed by an engineer who understood that every hour of delay multiplied the enemy's problems. Every tank destroyed, every road blocked, every attack repulsed, forced the Germans to commit more forces, burn more fuel, and fall further behind their impossibly optimistic timetable. Clarke positioned his Shermans in carefully chosen hull-down positions where only their turrets showed. He placed his armored infantry in the forests and villages forming natural strongpoints. He established interlocking fields of fire so that any German advance would face simultaneous fire from multiple directions. And he kept a mobile reserve ready to counterattack against any penetration. The men of Combat Command B dug in and waited. By 1400 hours on December 18th, the Germans attacked in force. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division hit the northern section of the perimeter, their Feldgrau uniformed infantry emerging from the tree line like gray ghosts in the snow. They came in the classic German assault formation, infiltration teams probing for weak points, followed by concentrated attacks supported by mortar and artillery fire. Clarke's men held. Barely. Tank destroyers of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged German Panzer IVs at ranges under 500 yards, the crack of their high-velocity guns echoing across the frozen landscape. Sherman tanks traded shots with German armor in brutal close-range duels, where the first shot meant survival and the second shot meant nothing at all. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, the attacks continued with mechanical German efficiency. Probe, attack, regroup, attack again. The Americans bent, but did not break. December 19th dawned cold and gray. The thermometer read -5 degrees Fahrenheit. Men's breath froze in their beards. Weapons jammed from the cold. And the German pressure intensified. Clarke now faced elements of 3 German divisions, the 18th and 62nd Volksgrenadier Divisions, and most ominously, the Führer-Begleit Brigade, an elite mechanized unit equipped with the latest German armor, including the fearsome Panther tank. The Panthers changed everything. The Sherman tank, America's workhorse armored vehicle, was simply outclassed. The Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 yards. The Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor at 500 yards. American tankers learned quickly. Shoot for the sides, shoot for the tracks, shoot for anything but the front, and pray. By mid-morning, German forces had nearly surrounded the St. Vith perimeter. Only a narrow corridor to the west remained open, and that was under constant artillery fire. Clarke received reports that could not be verified but could not be ignored. More German armor was approaching from the south. If those reports were accurate, the corridor would close completely within hours. The officers of Combat Command B came to Clarke with the obvious recommendation: withdraw now, while withdrawal was still possible. Every tactical manual, every principle of sound military judgment supported this conclusion. They were outnumbered at least 3-1. They were outgunned. They were nearly surrounded. Staying meant potential annihilation. Clarke listened. He walked to the monastery window and stared out at the frozen town where American soldiers were fighting and dying to hold a perimeter that logic said could not be held. Then he made his decision. We stay. We hold. His reasoning was ruthlessly pragmatic. Intelligence reports indicated that General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army headquarters was frantically repositioning forces to establish a new defensive line further west. The 82nd Airborne Division was moving into position near Wehrmacht. The 101st Airborne was digging in at Bastogne. British armor was rolling south as a strategic reserve. But all of those forces needed time. Time to move. Time to establish positions, time to organize a coherent defense. St. Vith was buying that time with American blood. Every hour Clarke held meant one fewer hour for the Germans to reach their objectives. Every German tank destroyed at St. Vith was one less tank threatening Antwerp. Every German regiment committed to reducing the St. Vith pocket was one less regiment available for the main advance. Clarke understood that Combat Command B might be sacrificed, but that sacrifice would give the Allied forces the breathing space they desperately needed. He also made another calculation, one that spoke to his understanding of German military doctrine. The Germans were operating on an extremely tight timetable. Their entire offensive plan assumed rapid advance, quick capture of fuel depots, and minimal resistance. The German army was running on fumes, literally. Every vehicle consumed precious gasoline that the Wehrmacht could not replace. By forcing the Germans to siege St. Vith rather than bypass it, Clarke was attacking their most critical vulnerability: logistics. The attacks on December 19th reached a crescendo of violence. German artillery pounded the American positions with methodical fury. The distinctive crack of German 88mm guns competed with the heavier boom of American 105mm howitzers. The winter air filled with a scream of Nebelwerfer rockets, the dreaded screaming mimes that terrified troops on both sides with their banshee wail. German infantry attacked repeatedly, pressing forward through the snow-covered fields and forests. They came with flamethrowers to burn out American strongpoints. They came with satchel charges to destroy American armor. They came with the desperation of soldiers who knew their Führer had staked everything on this offensive. And still, Clarke's men held. American casualties mounted horrifically. Aid stations overflowed, ammunition ran low. Men fought through exhaustion and frostbite, their fingers frozen to their weapons, their feet numb in their boots. By evening on December 19th, the situation had become critical. German forces had penetrated the northern section of the perimeter, threatening to split the American defense. Clarke committed his last reserve, personally directing a counterattack that threw the Germans back in vicious hand-to-hand combat. That night, as Clarke studied his maps by candlelight in the monastery, the mathematics of survival became undeniable. He had bought 2.5 days. His force had been reduced by nearly 30%. His ammunition was running critically low. His armor was down to fewer than 30 operational tanks. And German reinforcements continued to arrive. The question was no longer whether to withdraw. The question was whether withdrawal was still possible. At 0200 hours on December 20th, Clarke received the authorization he had been expecting. Withdraw Combat Command B to new positions west of Vith. But giving that order and executing it were entirely different propositions. The Americans now held a perimeter barely 3 miles across, nearly surrounded by German forces that outnumbered them 5-1. The only escape route was a single road running west through the village of Poteau, and that road was under direct German observation and artillery fire. Clarke planned the withdrawal with the same meticulous attention to detail he had applied to the defense. It would be a fighting withdrawal, a tactical maneuver that military theorists consider one of the most difficult operations in warfare. Units would disengage under fire, fall back in stages, establish new defensive positions to cover the withdrawal of other units, then repeat the process. All of this in darkness, in sub-zero temperatures, under constant enemy pressure. The withdrawal began at 0600 hours on December 21st, under cover of an artillery barrage that expended nearly every remaining American shell.
Rear guard elements of the 38th Armored Infantry Battalion held their positions, trading their lives for minutes that allowed their comrades to escape. German forces, sensing the American withdrawal, attacked with renewed fury. Panthers and Panzer IVs pushed forward, their commanders smelling victory. But Clarke had prepared one final surprise. At key road junctions and bridge sites, American engineers had prepared demolition charges. As the last American units passed through, these charges detonated in massive explosions that blocked roads, collapsed bridges, and created obstacles that would take the Germans hours to clear. The withdrawal itself became an epic of endurance and courage. Tank crews nursed their damaged Shermans westward, the vehicles trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid. Wounded soldiers rode on engine decks and tank turrets, their frozen hands gripping whatever handholds they could find. Infantry battalions fought rear guard actions in village after village, then melted away into the forests before the Germans could encircle them. The columns stretched for miles along the icy road, moving at a crawl, every minute expecting the German attack that would turn withdrawal into rout. Artillery shells fell among the vehicles, but the column kept moving. German tanks appeared on the flanks, but American tank destroyers engaged them long enough for the column to pass. By the evening of December 21st, Combat Command B reached new defensive positions near Wilhelm, battered but intact as a fighting force. Behind them, Vith burned. German troops occupied the shattered town and its vital crossroads. The Germans had won the tactical victory. They held Vith. But they had lost something far more valuable: time. Clarke's defense had cost the German offensive 5.5 days.
5.5 days during which the Wehrmacht consumed fuel it couldn't replace, suffered casualties it couldn't afford, and fell further behind a timetable that had been unrealistic from the start. Field Marshal Wilhelm Model, commanding Army Group B, later acknowledged that the delay at St. Vith had been critical to the failure of the offensive. German commanders had planned to capture St. Vith on December 17th. Instead, they didn't secure it until December 21st. Those 4 extra days allowed the 82nd Airborne to establish an impenetrable line in the north. Those 4 days allowed the 101st Airborne to fortify Bastogne in the south. Those 4 days allowed Patton's Third Army to disengage from operations in the Saar, wheel 90 degrees north, and drive toward Bastogne in one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history.
Most significantly, those 4 days allowed Allied commanders to understand the true nature and scope of the German offensive and respond accordingly. What might have been a catastrophic breakthrough became instead a bulge, a salient that could be contained, compressed, and ultimately eliminated. German officers interrogated after the war were unanimous in their assessment. The defense of St. Vith had been the critical factor in the failure of the Ardennes Offensive. One captured German general stated bluntly, "Your man at St. Vith understood what he was doing. He defeated our entire strategy." That man was Colonel Bruce Clarke. The Battle of the Bulge continued until late January 1945, ultimately becoming the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. American casualties exceeded 80,000 men, including nearly 20,000 killed. German casualties were even higher, over 100,000 men, and most critically, tanks and fuel that the Wehrmacht could never replace. Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division had suffered grievously during its stand at St. Vith. Of the approximately 5,000 men who entered the defense, over 1,500 became casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Of the 54 Sherman tanks that began the battle, fewer than 30 emerged still operational. But their sacrifice achieved its purpose. The defense of St. Vith stands as one of the decisive delaying actions in military history, a testament to the principle that time is often more valuable than terrain. Bruce Clarke received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at St. Vith, second only to the Medal of Honor. The citation read, in part, "Through his outstanding leadership, tactical skill, and personal courage, Colonel Clarke held a vital position against overwhelming enemy forces, thereby enabling the establishment of defensive lines which contained the German offensive." The 7th Armored Division received a Presidential Unit Citation for its defense of St. Vith, one of the highest honors that can be bestowed upon a military unit. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later wrote that the defense of St. Vith was an outstanding example of how a single commander's determination and tactical skill can influence the outcome of an entire campaign. Yet Clarke himself remained characteristically modest about his role. In post-war interviews, he consistently deflected credit to the soldiers who had done the actual fighting and dying. "I just told them to hold," he said. "They're the ones who did it." He continued his military career after the war, eventually retiring as a 4-star general in 1962. He died in 1988 at the age of 84, having lived long enough to see his actions at St. Vith recognized as a masterpiece of defensive warfare. The German military, famous for its tactical excellence and professional military analysis, offered perhaps the most fitting tribute.
In post-war studies of the Ardennes Offensive, conducted by the German General Staff, the defense of St. Vith was described as an exemplary action by an American commander who understood that the strategic objective was not to win a battle, but to impose delay. One German colonel, interviewed years later, put it more simply: "We defeated the Americans at St. Vith, but that unknown American colonel defeated our strategy." The defense of St. Vith stands as proof that individual leadership and tactical brilliance can change the course of history, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Bruce Clarke bought time with American lives, and that time bought Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.